So Camilla's power over the sovereign grant was just taken away by a group of judges. And the thing that actually brought it all down was not some big conspiracy or stolen money. It was a seating card that was not on a table and a finance officer who folded a piece of paper into his jacket because he was too afraid to sign it. That is where this entire story lives, in that one moment where a mid-level palace official decided that staying quiet was more dangerous than speaking up, and the whole carefully managed illusion of control just disappeared. Before we get into the mess, take a second to subscribe to Royal Daily Report so you do not miss what comes next. King Charles walked into that courtroom expecting a difficult day. What he got was a complete taking apart of the arrangement that had quietly governed his household for years. The judges did not just issue a small punishment or suggest some procedure improvements. They removed Camilla entirely from every single part of the sovereign grant process. She cannot approve spending. She cannot influence spending. She cannot redirect funds. She cannot advise on allocations. Her representatives were pulled out of oversight meetings. Her financial briefings were stopped. And then the court ordered an independent review of every decision that ever had her approval. This is the judicial way of saying, we are not just worried about what might happen going forward. We are worried about what already happened. Charles sat there with his glasses lowered, not turning pages, not speaking to staff. When someone leaned toward him, he just raised one hand. Across the room, Camilla closed her folder very carefully. That carefulness said more than any outburst could have. She understood immediately that this was not a negotiation. The order took effect right then in that room while they were still sitting there. The sovereign grant, for anyone who has not been following the mechanics of royal funding, is the public money that pays for official royal duties. Staff salaries, travel, ceremonies, property maintenance on homes where they live. Basically the money that runs the monarchy. Control over that money determines which priorities move forward and which ones quietly disappear. And the court just looked at the Queen Consort and said, you no longer have any say in any of it. But the truly devastating part for Charles was not just that his wife lost influence. It was that the judgment essentially said he had failed to maintain the boundary between his marriage and the monarchy itself. A king's judgment only works if the public trusts that judgment. The ruling suggested that trust had been compromised, and that Charles either did not see it happening or did not stop it. That is a humiliation that cuts deeper than any policy dispute. That is a judgment on his judgment. So what actually happened? The court exposed that several spending proposals had moved through what they called an unofficial advisory channel connected to Camilla's private office. Not every proposal got approved. But the judges concluded that personal preference had pushed against constitutional expenditure. I want to pause on that phrase because it is doing a lot of careful legal work. What they are saying is that money meant for public royal duties was being shaped by private preference, and they had the documentation to prove it. Camilla sat through this realizing that this was not about one isolated decision anymore. The court had identified a pattern, a hidden pattern. And then Charles found the line in the judgment that must have made his stomach drop. Someone inside the royal household had delivered financial correspondence to independent examiners. This had not come from outside. It had not come from journalists or critics or people against the monarchy. It had come from someone close enough to know where the evidence was kept, and brave enough or angry enough to hand it over. The person at the center of that decision was a man named Martin Hale, the deputy keeper of finance. And the event that broke everything open was something called the Windsor Cultural Patrons Reception. Now, when the palace first started reconstructing what happened at Windsor, everyone had dismissed this reception as routine. It was the kind of event that happens all the time. But the judges kept returning to it because one exchange from that evening appeared repeatedly in correspondence that was more than a year old, so they dug deeper. And what they found was the point of no return. Here is how it went. Camilla's office had been gradually moving deeper into decisions about receptions, charitable engagements, staff changes, and refurbishment priorities. Some of these events served official royal duties. Some of them also benefited patronages closely tied to individual family members. The line between public expense and private preference started getting harder to defend. Now palace administrators used to handle these questions through past practice and trust. Someone would say, "This is how we have always done it," and that was usually enough. But newer finance officers had started demanding written justifications whenever sovereign grant money was involved. They wanted a paper trail. They wanted to know why public funds were being used for specific events, and who was making those decisions. That shift in internal culture is what set up the confrontation at Windsor. At that reception, Camilla approached Martin Hale privately and asked him to reclassify an expanded hospitality program as an official state-facing engagement. The revised costs included extra guest accommodation, private transport, and alterations to reception rooms connected to organizations within her preferred patronage network. Hale was standing beside a side table holding the amended expenditure sheet. Camilla spoke in a controlled voice, placed one finger beside the classification code, and told him the king expected the reception to proceed without delay. That is the line. That is the 6 words that unraveled everything. The king expected the reception to proceed without delay. Hale did not challenge her. He did not argue. But after she walked away, he folded the unsigned paper, slipped it inside his jacket, and that night told another official, named Eleanor Price, that he could not approve the classification without independent review. Price warned him that refusal might destroy both their careers. But Hale had heard something in that exchange that scared him more than getting fired. Invoking Charles's expectation had transformed a request into implied royal pressure. It was no longer a discussion between colleagues. It was a directive carrying the weight of the sovereign's name. Now Camilla almost certainly believed she was protecting an event designed to strengthen the monarchy's cultural relationships. In her mind, the objections were needless bureaucracy. She had served for years. She had absorbed hostility and scrutiny and public rejection. She probably felt that her judgment should have earned trust by that point. But Hale felt something completely different. He saw a line being crossed, and he realized that staying silent would make him responsible for whatever happened next. So he started preserving emails, meeting notes, and handwritten instructions. Weeks later, revised documents appeared, using language almost identical to the disputed request. Even though Hale had never signed the original, someone had forced the decision through another route, and Hale was now convinced of it. He had the receipts. When that evidence reached external examiners, Charles believed the matter could still be contained. But then Camilla saw Hale's name in the inquiry file and demanded a private confrontation. This forced the king toward a choice he had spent months avoiding. For days, Charles did not ask the question that threatened everything. He defended Camilla publicly. He challenged the severity of the court's restrictions. He demanded loyalty from his staff. But one line in Martin Hale's testimony kept circling in his head. The Queen Consort had invoked the king's expectation. When Charles and Camilla finally stood alone together, he placed the testimony on the table and asked her 6 words. "Did you use my name to force that approval?" That question transformed the legal crisis into a marital reckoning. Charles knew he had never examined the reclassification himself. That left 3 possibilities. Either his wishes had been misunderstood, exaggerated, or deliberately used. Camilla refused to accept that normal palace practice had become evidence of wrongdoing. She argued that royal work had always depended on verbal understanding, delegated judgment, and trust. To her, officials were rewriting the customs because public pressure demanded a visible target, and she had become the easiest one to sacrifice. Charles pushed Hale's documented account toward her. She would not touch it. He told her that a sovereign's name could never become a shortcut through financial controls. His voice stayed low, but his hand was trembling as he removed his signature ring and placed it beside the file. That ring carries his royal identity. Placing it down like that was symbolic, in a way that words could not match. Camilla saw a wall rising between them. She reminded him of the years she had absorbed hostility while protecting his emotional stability. Now she said when the institution turned against her, he was starting to sound like the judges instead of the man who had promised not to abandon her. Then she admitted something. She had instructed her office to resolve the classification problem after Martin Hale refused. But she denied ordering anyone to falsify documents. Charles asked who prepared the revised wording. Camilla named her private secretary. And then Charles had to tell her that the private secretary had already given a recorded statement saying the instructions came directly from Camilla. The silence that followed was the kind that changes relationships permanently. Charles rose and moved toward the door without embracing her. She asked whether William had shaped his response. Charles did not answer. That silence revealed that the crisis had become a struggle over who would define a monarchy's future. But neither Charles nor Camilla could reverse what had happened, because the ruling had already transferred control to a small oversight group. Their quiet authority now outweighed every private promise made inside the palace. This is where the story shifts from royal drama to something more structural. The people who now held the power were not the ones with titles and ceremonies. They were accountants, constitutional advisors, treasury representatives, and independent auditors. They did not shout or threaten or seek revenge. They just opened the files, compared the signatures, and started removing royal discretion line by line. For Charles, that calm process was more frightening than open rebellion. The panel chair paused beside him before the first meeting and said the review was designed to protect the crown, not embarrass the king. Charles replied that the embarrassment had already happened. The panel, this small external body, now had temporary authority over disputed sovereign grant decisions. They could freeze spending, demand records, review finance-related appointments, and reject projects that lacked a clear official purpose. Rank meant nothing inside that room. Classification meant everything. One of the panel members, someone named Reed, explained that any event serving mainly personal interests would have to be privately funded going forward. Charles asked whether royal discretion still carried weight after generations of practice. Another member named Jonathan answered that tradition could guide judgment, but it could not replace written accountability. The king stayed silent. But that silence revealed how deeply the answer had cut. William attended these sessions as an observer. He avoided every sign of triumph because he understood something complicated. The reforms might protect a monarchy he would one day inherit, but watching his father lose control brought no satisfaction. At one point, Charles dropped his pen. William instinctively reached toward it, but the monarch retrieved it first, turning an accident into a quiet refusal of help. That small moment captured the entire dynamic between them. The heir trying to support the institution. The king feeling replaced by his own son. Then the files widened the crisis. The Windsor reception was not the only proposal whose description had changed after objections were raised. Staffing expansions, residence alterations, transportation arrangements, hospitality costs linked to Camilla's office. All of them had been broadened until private preference appeared to resemble official necessity. Reed stressed that improper influence did not automatically prove personal enrichment. The deeper danger was structural. An unofficial channel had developed through which the Queen Consort's preferences received unusual priority, and that channel now had to be dismantled completely. The panel announced immediate restrictions. Her advisors would be removed from grant-related meetings. Pending proposals would be frozen, and William would be the one to enforce the order. The prince understood immediately what that meant. He would have to carry the judgment into his father's household himself, not as a bureaucrat delivering paperwork, but as a son telling his father's wife that her access had been revoked. By nightfall, The judgment was no longer confined to courtroom language. Doors were being locked. Invitations were withdrawn. Names were removed from meeting lists. And Camilla was about to discover exactly how quickly ceremonial influence can disappear. Power rarely vanishes with a trumpet blast. Sometimes it disappears through a cancelled meeting, a disabled access card, or a chair quietly removed from a table. For Camilla, the new reality arrived through a series of small exclusions that became impossible to ignore. By the end of the first day, she remained queen consort in title. But within the financial machinery of the palace, she had become an outsider. Her office could still manage her personal schedule, correspondence, charities, and privately funded work. But the oversight order now barred her from any meeting involving sovereign grant allocations or publicly financed staff. Every decision connected to that money required strict distance from her influence. Then came the moment that probably stung more than any courtroom ruling. Camilla approached the weekly financial planning meeting and found her usual place card missing from the table. A palace official quietly informed her that attendance was now restricted. She looked through the open doorway and saw William already seated inside. The future king met her eyes but said nothing. She remained still until the footman gently closed the door. Camilla removed her glasses and pressed them between both hands. Her private secretary stepped closer, but she ordered him away. Only after he left did she whisper that they had made her invisible inside her own home. The title remained. The access had vanished. That is a particular kind of humiliation, not being shouted at or publicly denounced, but being quietly removed from a room you expected to enter, having a door closed while you are still standing there. Charles erupted when he learned she had been turned away without warning. He confronted William and accused him of allowing a legal restriction to become public humiliation. William replied that the court's order could not be softened whenever obedience became painful. His calmness only deepened the monarch's anger. William was trapped between compassion and duty. He did not want to punish Camilla, but he refused to let the palace appear to be evading the judgment. Charles heard that answer differently. He saw his son acting less like an heir and more like a replacement. Then the first frozen project was revealed, a major refurbishment linked to rooms used by Camilla's household. Independent reviewers found that its urgency had been exaggerated. This strengthened the belief that her office had received unusual priority in the allocation of resources. That evening, Charles summoned William again. Before William entered, Catherine stopped him and urged him to speak as a son, not as an enforcer. She had warned him for months that financial transparency needed strengthening before the next grant review. Her concern was broader than Camilla. Catherine feared that old palace habits, built on trust and private understanding, could no longer survive modern scrutiny. She was right. When William entered the private library that night, there were no advisors, legal folders, or constitutional phrases between them. Only a father wounded by humiliation, and a son burdened by what came next. Charles had spent days fighting the judgment as though authority alone were at stake. But William discovered that the king's deepest fear was not losing control of royal money. It was losing the woman who had stood beside him through everything. Charles poured 2 glasses of water but left both untouched. He said everyone expected him to choose between Camilla and the monarchy, as though one had to be sacrificed to save the other. William answered that accountability did not require abandonment. He explained that defending her dignity was not the same as defending her access to public funds, and he promised he would never support deliberate humiliation. The monarch's anger weakened. He admitted he feared Camilla would see his compliance as proof that he had never truly protected her. She had endured years of hostility while standing beside him, and he could not bear to become another person who stepped away when loyalty became difficult. William listened without interrupting, then told him the judgment had to be accepted fully, and that is when Charles finally confessed what shame had kept buried. He had suspected informal pressure was being used before the inquiry became public. He had seen the warning signs. But he had avoided demanding answers because he feared what those answers would do to his marriage. He had not been completely unaware. He had chosen not to confront it. That admission changed everything between father and son. For once, neither man tried to win. Both tried to preserve what remained. The next morning, Charles decided to issue a statement accepting the court's restrictions and endorsing permanent independent oversight. He told Camilla himself before the announcement, refusing to let officials deliver the blow. The statement's first sentence offered surrender without cruelty. Within hours, every major broadcast carried it. The palace had finally chosen acceptance over resistance. But outside the gates, the nation was already deciding whether Charles's change of heart represented courage, weakness, or the first honest act of a wounded reign. The morning edition of the Daily Chronicle carried a full-page photograph beneath the headline, "The Crown Closes Its Own Door." Reporters held copies above their heads outside Buckingham Palace, as broadcasters repeated the phrase across the world. By midday, crowds had gathered near the Victoria Memorial. Some carried signs reading "Public Money, Public Rules." Others placed flowers beside the palace railings in support of Charles. One woman told a broadcaster that the monarch looked broken, but added that accepting the ruling might be the first step toward restoring trust. Inside the palace, Charles watched the coverage without sound. When the newspaper appeared on screen, he ordered an aide to switch off the television. Seconds later, he changed his mind and asked for the volume to return. He would hear the criticism rather than hide from it. Camilla refused to watch. She sat alone and read his statement twice. It confirmed her exclusion, but did not condemn her personally. That restraint left her torn between gratitude and resentment. Broadcasters soon revealed that support for independent oversight had risen sharply, while confidence in the monarchy had begun recovering. Charles had lost control. Yet surrendering it was preserving the crown. That is the paradox at the center of this entire situation. The thing that felt like defeat was actually the thing that stopped the damage. Subscribe to Royal Daily Report for live palace coverage and exclusive analysis. That evening, Charles asked Camilla to meet him again. No evidence file waited between them this time. The crisis had begun with a court stripping her of financial authority, but it ended with something far more profound. A king accepting that love could not be used as constitutional permission. Charles told Camilla he would not appeal the restrictions. The sovereign grant would now remain permanently separated from her private influence. Independent reviewers would examine every decision and require written approval. Her office could still manage charitable work, ceremonial responsibilities, and personal matters. But it could no longer shape public spending. Camilla asked whether he believed she had deliberately harmed the crown. Charles answered that he did not believe she intended destruction, but he believed that loyalty, frustration, and entitlement had blurred a boundary that should never have been crossed. His acceptance of the ruling prevented a prolonged constitutional confrontation and protected the monarchy from appearing above the standards expected of every public institution. Camilla finally admitted that she had treated resistance from officials as disrespect rather than warning. She did not offer a dramatic apology. Instead, she acknowledged that invoking Charles's wishes had placed staff in an impossible position. For the first time, she accepted the hardest truth of the entire crisis. Good intentions could not erase damaging results. Charles told her she remained his wife and companion, but her future place within the monarchy would be defined by service, not access. He reached across the table. After a long hesitation, Camilla took his hand. Their marriage survived, but the silent privileges surrounding it did not. William later accepted a formal role supporting transparent grant governance. Independent auditors retained final review powers. The prince did not celebrate. He understood that reform had been purchased through his father's humiliation and Camilla's loss of status. The monarch returned to duty changed. He no longer called the ruling an attack on his family. He called it a necessary correction. The judges had not destroyed the monarchy or ended his marriage. They had ended the belief that closeness to the sovereign could quietly become control over public resources. And so the crisis closed not with Camilla restored or Charles vindicated, but with the monarchy forced to choose its future, and choosing finally and decisively, accountability over personal power. Royal Daily Report, your source for palace truth, breaking news, and royal family updates. Subscribe now.